I think the thing I try to impress upon people is we're talking about agronomy and crop nutrition the way it should be, and that's not according to Summit Gold. It's a matter of how things work in the world of plants and soils, and I think this is what really throws people. I often tell them that the study of plants and soils and how they interact to optimize production, that's really the definition of agronomy. Agronomy isn't, something that's down at the local box shop that says, okay, let's get a soil test and see how many pounds of P and K we need to put on. That's what a lot of people, when they hear an agronomist is coming, they might bring their soil test for a second or third, free opinion, which I give them most times, and probably 90% of the time, I'm not telling them to put on any dry P and K anyway, because their levels are good enough that, just like this year, this meeting needs to be focused around return on investment. And there's a lot of people this year saying, what can we do to improve our return on investment? And oftentimes, depending on rotations and how they're doing it and what they've done in the past, a lot of times we tell them, well, let's pare back on the dry fertilizer program. If you cut out dry fertilizer even for a single season, you're not going to lose your farm. And it doesn't mean that you're going to have a poor yield if you don't put dry PK on. I said, how many years do you suppose we've been studying NP and K in this country? Just a guesstimate. 70, 80 years, right? I mean, World War II was where the major start of a lot of the research production came. If there was, and where are we studying it? Are we studying it just out here in our backyard?
In the universities.
Yeah, let the records say that it was done at universities, right? I mean, so this year for the 955th time, we're going to study how to try to get more P and K and maybe the same dry form, but into the plant a little bit better. If there was a direct correlation between your soil test levels on that sheet and your final yield, if in 100 years of science, and there is no zero anymore, we can measure 10 places below the decimal point with chemistry. We understand biochemistry. We understand how to find things. There is no zero. If in 100 years, with the last 20 to 25 that we can do all this, we have all that information and data, do you not think if there was a direct correlation to your final yield and those numbers on a soil test report, that you would see it on the front, in the middle, and on the back of every single periodical that they play? And I asked guys, have you seen that? And they're all sitting there, and a lot of them kind of get red in the face. Some turn white in the face. It's like, oh, man. So once you realize that there is no direct correlation whatsoever, none, to your final yield and those numbers on that paper, some people find that freeing. Some people find it scares them half to death because they've spent their whole life trying to figure that out. Now, it doesn't mean that you throw it away. You're not throwing away the baby with the bathwater. What you're looking for in a soil test is the balance. What do the macronutrients look like, the N, P, and K, with calcium and magnesium? And what do the micronutrients look like? And are they in some kind of a balance? Because all a soil test really is to tell you, are you near a balance or are you out of balance? And if you're out of balance, are you oversupplied or undersupplied? That's all it can do. Because I have seen soil tests that had numbers on it that would frighten you to death, saying this guy's going to lose his farm this year. And that'd be one of the highest yielding farms you've ever seen. And I've seen guys that have soil test levels that are off the scale. You say, there's no way this guy can have a failure. And yet he's disappointed with numbers that would make most farmers sick. So that's hard for people to accept because they don't understand the connections. And that's what this is all about. And if you understand, if we plug a plant into this and it's sitting here doing something that people don't realize, which is feeding the plant, because the other part of this I didn't put in here is plants feed the soil as much as the soil feeds the plant. We're starting to look at what we're doing out here, and we've done this now for more than 30 years. And I ask people, what's going on with the rest of the fertilizer industry? And just to save time, I mean, we're going to hit the high points. Ag tech and funding is rebounding, and they're going into alternative fertilizers. Mosaic, one of the biggest fertilizer companies in the world, is going into alternative fertilizers, and biologicals are crucial to the evolution of crop nutrition. And General Mills, the large companies that are producing the food, little by little are starting to dip their toe in this because they can't keep getting the poor quality grains back that they're putting into these foodstuffs and expect to survive. They've got to have something different. So are their offerings more like ours or less like ours? And as you talk to people, when they've said, well, you've been doing this for 25, 30 years, it's funny, the stuff you were telling us 30 years that they're doing now, I'm one of those fortunate few people that made that prediction. It's like, if you're going to get the top end when it comes down to it, you have to involve nature and the natural system, because life has to understand life to be functional. When we saw salted fertilizers coming into it, we said, "Wow, look at the increases in the yields." Yes, that happens up to a certain point, but you can only put so much salted fertilizer into a system before now you have to have so much water to finish it, and you're not really helping the life situation. You're just helping meet certain needs of certain micronutrient minerals and macronutrient minerals to balance it and get it up to a certain point. But to get on farther than that, you have to have life. The only way you're going to get more life out of this field and this crop is to infuse more life into the soil and into that crop. That's the way it's working. And we're seeing more and more of that all the time, which is why we have people that are buying products like ours that are more, we'll say, natural type based situations. And it's like, how in the world can these things that don't have enough fertilizer in them cause these things to happen? We don't understand that. Well, it's because life is interpreting life. We talk about the 4 words of life: sugars, amino acids, which are sugars with nitrogen units married on them, amino acids that train together that make proteins, and proteins that train together in a big fancy molecule that are called enzymes. Those are the 4 words. So the question we should all be asking is, if the soil is designed to feed the plant, and the plant is designed to feed the soil in return, because the soil can't feed itself, it can't just reach up in the sky and get food, how can I help this exchange work better, faster, and more efficiently? That's really what we're talking about. How do we take a soil, balance it, put a plant in, make it grow better, and then make the plant grow better in that soil at the same time, all at the same time we're feeding the microbes? We have to consider that when we plant a crop, what environment do we get? Well, a lot of times we get limited and restricted moisture. We deal with that all the time. We have early and cold planting and cold planting and germination conditions. We fight that. We get a low organic matter and low biological activity. We can have really intensive sunlight that heats the soil up and makes it hotter than a pistol. Then we get intensive tillage or long-term no-till. Both of those can provide different stresses, even long-term no-till. If you're in the middle of a hot, dry summer and you got a corn crop growing or a cotton crop growing or a peanut crop growing, and the week that it needs a boatload of nitrogen, it starts to dry down, and the microbes are looking for nitrogen too. They tie up nitrogen, and you can get a nitrogen deficiency in a beautiful long-term no-till soil. People don't realize that. And then also you've got pesticide stress. So when we get these extreme conditions, we have to be able to identify opportunities we have to enable that crop to thrive. No matter what time of the season we're in, we got to do that. And when we start to look at a corn crop, we see these pieces all the time. This is from the University of Illinois Extension. VE, a single leaf, the lobe leaf, V1, V3, V7, V10, VT, R1, R6. All right, so we know what stages they're at, but do we know what they do and what they need at those different stages? Because this is what it's all about. So in all these situations, we're starting to evaluate. So we have a toolbox that if you see these names, you'll pull it out in one of the books and you'd see different names of different products. But they're designed to be helping out prior to getting to some of these conditions that we know when the plant needs things or the soil needs things to be able to make the plant work well. So if we use these tools, how do we bridge this gap? Well, if we have limited and restricted moisture, we pull out Engage. So as we were talking to Tony, the superintendent here, owner superintendent, he's got trouble with grass and getting moisture to go into different places. Well, we use soil penetrance to allow water to move in and move around effectively within the soil. And it works the same with a crop under irrigation. Early cold and planting and germination conditions, we use 725-5, SG Infuse, or Assist. These are products that contain orthophosphate, available to the plant, give the plant energy. SG Infuse has food sources with micronutrients for both the plant and the microbes. Assist the same way. You can actually give the plant the ability to survive early cold planting conditions by providing it that information. So instead of 1030-40, which is locked up for a long time, especially under cold, wet conditions, and doesn't give you orthophosphate, and we're going to cover that here in a few minutes, you have stuff that you know is going to go right in the plant and feed it and make the root systems grow. So it'll survive the conditions. Same thing under low organic matter and biological activity. Plants eat first at the table. I'm sorry. microbes eat first at the table of the soil. If you feed them and feed them properly, they live in cycles, live and die, and they release fertility to you. So you want to make sure you're feeding the microbes as well as feeding the plant. If you got intensive sunlight, you get a lot of antioxidants that you need there because you're going to get free radicals created. So you put in energy to make the plant grow effective, fight the stress with extra sugars, and 725.5 does that. SG Infused brings in the micronutrients. Assist brings in lots of extra food. Advance brings in several of those things. What you're telling the plant is, look, here's a little food, here's a little micronutrients, make some antioxidants, fight off the stress, you're going to be fine. And lo and behold, it does. Intensive tillage, well, it's the same type of thing. You're burning up organic matter in the soil, so you're trying to put things back in there for the plant and the soil to do that. And pesticide stress, we have SG Advance, which is the micronutrients, some sugars, some stress relief, some live biology, some phosphites, and some MKP that actually, between those two, there's 2 fertilizers in there that actually have a legal label to control certain fungi. So it's a fertilizer that controls fungus. So if you don't have perfect warm conditions on your farm, you stimulate them or simulate them for the plant so that the plant knows that there's stress, but you're telling it, I get it, there's stress, everything's going to be fine, move on through it, and lo and behold, that's what happens. This is something that throws people because fertilizer has been sold for so many years, and fertilizer is not fertilizer, and we help people understand that. Plants only uptake orthophosphate form. That's it. P2O5 is what we call it in the industry. H3PO4 3- is another chemical, that's phosphoric acid, but it's orthophosphate. 90% of the phosphate must be made available through biological activity for your plant because it's going to last through the season, it's going to grow through the season, it needs phosphate through the season. There are very few things we can do for phosphate fertilizer that's going to last the entire season. This is the interesting thing. If you start looking at plants in general, roots have 10 times more sites to absorb primary orthophosphate than any other nutrient. That's down to even the smallest of roots. On a root, when you analyze a root, they've looked at different elements that are absorbed through the plant root interface, they call it, where the roots just touch the soil. So they're looking at the physical structure of the soil, or of the physical structure of the roots. And they notice that on the roots, where orthophosphate goes in, everywhere on every root has this ability to absorb that. That tells you something about that plant. That plant uses phosphate as an orthophosphate form to make energy. It's critical to making energy. That helps it store energy, transfer energy, regain energy. Transference of energy back and forth chemically within a plant is driven by orthophosphate. Now, the interesting thing about this is when they measured a lot of phosphorus in a plant, the only way in some cases where they do research, the only way that the plant can get the orthophosphate is through biologically because they don't put other phosphate in that soil, that system. So it's got to be mineral. So it's got to be broken out. 90% of the phosphorus that get in these plants comes from the soil, not just fertilizer, through that soil system interface with biology. Cold soils or cool soils suppress the biology and therefore would suppress the natural phosphorus release as a result. So if you know that, it's like, well, what happens if I buy 725.5 and put it on this germinating plant and this young root system? If that root's starting to expand, I'll pick it up. So that's right. That's what it's for. What it is basically is an insurance program. I mean, it's designed to do several things. On a corn plant, it's critical because by the time the corn plant's 3 leaves tall, it's already determined how many rows around it's going to have. Oh, there's no question. If you look at 725.5, that's an 80% ortho, 20% poly. If you look at 1030.40, if it's a beautiful green product that's been produced, that could be as much as 30% ortho. If it's a used spent byproduct that's dark or black or brown, that can be as low as 5 or 10%. So the rest of the poly that's in there has yet to be converted to turn that over. That means it takes biology and heat to drive the conversion to get it to turn into orthophosphate. Right. That's right. Right. The industry has not set any specific standard. They just get whatever they can. And a lot of that's spent out of the auto industry. They dip cars in that. So the reason it's black is because it was actually invented. I knew the man that I worked with for years as an agronomist. His dad worked at the TVA. He invented 103040. He invented 103040, so they had a solution fertilizer that was phosphorus that they could send across the country because they needed that to dip cars in. Because when you dip the car in the 103040, the phosphorus would actually bind to the iron on the outside of the metal. Then they washed it, and the metal was clean, and you could paint it. Iron phosphate, when you look at it as a color, is dark brown and black. So all that spent acid for years and years is not just necessarily just for the cars. They can do it for any kind of metal or steel or anything. They can do that. So it's a used byproduct is what it is. And it came back to the industry because it had phosphorus in it. And so it was an inexpensive form because they're trying to get rid of their trash, right? So that was where that came from. If you get a nice, pretty green product, that's been a manufactured product that's never been anywhere. It's just designed specifically to come out to agriculture. But the highest, I called the company. I said, what's the highest orthophosphate content you can get out of 103040? And they said, if you're lucky, 30%. So you're looking at a product that's made and manufactured at 80%, specifically because that's what we're after, or using what the industry offers for whatever price it offers at about 30%. You can still set it outside. If you brought it in late summer, early fall, and put it into a tank, into a really hard, intensive sunlight and heat, then in a tank, it can still convert a little. But that's the best you're going to get. So here, you're buying that. Now, this is the interesting part. Enhanced rooting leads to more feeding points and additional uptake. So the more roots you get, since it's got all these sites, the better you're digging phosphate out of the soil. And you're going to get a high net increase in phosphate efficiency and utilization, the better the root mass is. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to put so much salt in there that you restrict the root growth. Because if you restrict the root growth, now you're telling the plant you're only going to get so much phosphate this year anyway. But if you do things that aren't low salt and allow that soil system to expand, the funny thing is about a plant, if it doesn't find its fertilizer, what does it do? It digs. And it puts on bigger root masses on lower levels of fertilizer. And people have seen that for years. They know that. One of the things that's killed the corn industry is we have bred in yield. To breed up the yield, to breed up the ear, you have to maintain higher levels of protein. So if the corn plant is making its ear size when it's this tall, 3 leaves tall, it's got to have a blow load of protein. The only way you get more protein into this plant typically is to breed out the roots. You've got to pull the roots back to hold the protein to make the ear bigger. When you pull the roots back and then you put them into situations out here where they're highly stressed, people are like, Pythium is killing me. Pythium's eating the roots right off of my corn plant. I get any Pythium at all and I'm done. I'm washed up in the water. We tell them it's like, yes, this is the hard part. And the number one thing that the breeders have done in the last 15 to 20 years is tell people, look, you need more potash. These plants are bred and they're bred that they need more potash. Why do you need more potash? Because you ain't got any roots. So you have to put more potash in there because this limited amount of root system is not going to dig for its roots. Or we go in there and we tell the plant, hey, how about if we put a little root growth stimulant on you, or we put low levels of biology, which stimulates root growth, and low levels of phosphate. We put on everything that allows that plant to make a bigger root mass. And when it does, it makes the same or better yields, and it lives through the summer a lot better because it's got better roots. I'm telling you, it's fascinating the things we don't know. Didn't have a root system. You can go back to the years because I was just getting off the agronomy stint that I had with Northrop King, and when they started breeding those, see what happened was when DeKalb figured out what Pioneer's issue was, and they bred up their root mass, and all of a sudden they had a gap in the late 90s. You know, when 3394 was out there, it was whipping their butts right and left. They figured it out, they bred it in, and then all of a sudden they closed that gap, and Pioneer's sitting here with DeKalb now giving them fits. Why? Because what happened was the only reaction that Pioneer had to be able to get the root, to get the yield to jump more, was to do exactly what I just said. Breed out the root, breed up the ear. So when everything is perfect many times, it's hard to beat Pioneer. But we're talking about perfect. We don't get perfect very often. So typically now what's going on is DeKalb has been whipping up on Pioneer because Pioneer isn't doing things they need to do to make sure that the root mass is strong enough to do the things it needs to do to support that system. Where we have people coming in with Pioneer corn and using our stuff, they've begun to close the gap back because they're getting now a little bit of the best of both worlds because they didn't realize it's like, well, if we do things that actually encourage root growth, and it does encourage root growth on some of the Pioneer corns that have a little poor root package, they're fine.
It got all of a sudden where you growing all plants.
Yes. Right. Right. Well, and that's the other thing is when people saw that and they saw that plant mass, what'd they do with their nitrogen? They went up, and so the more nitrogen you put to it, if the soil stays wet, it turns to nitrate. When it grows to nitrate, it grows like crazy. Of course, then you got to be careful because then you're going to get some green snap if you don't know what you're doing at the wrong time. That's all driven by the fact there's too much nitrate in the system, and the plant's growing like crazy because nitrate's what makes the plant grow big and tall and pretty, but it won't do a single solitary thing for reproduction. Ammonium and amine forms of nitrogen are the only things that influence that system. So you got all these things going on, and the fascinating thing is if you understand, this goes a little further, that you can actually put other things in here to help these root masses grow with biology. You can put in assist and complement biology, which is complement's the name for the biological program that we had, and increases the rooting, makes the phosphate and the micros more available to the plant, increase the sugar level in that plant so that it has more energy to make more roots. And when the soil micros are deficient, now micronutrients, we have different chelates we can put in there and fill that bill. So what we've done is created programs where you can mix all this stuff together, put it into a, if you will, a tonic right around that root system. You crank up the biology, you crank up the root mass, you crank up the availability of the micronutrients. And when this young plant that's setting an ear by V3 to V5, it's setting an ear, it sets a bigger ear. You're not done yet because you still got the rest of the season to run. But the objective is knowing that when we go back to that picture of what the different stages are, if you know by V3 to V5, you've got to set this ear mass for this ear size. You want to get a root mass underneath it because it's going to dig and find everything it wants at that early side. And then that way, at least you're not looking at small ear size come what may. You're looking at a good system.
This be with a large presence of biology enough to support it on your crop when you're setting here, when you're in there and you're looking at your ears as they're set. Didn't you say things like the height of the ear set would be similar in the area that the biology helps? The placement of the ear on the top, on the stalk.
Uniformity is what you're after.
Right.
And when you put these things in there, as long as each and every plant gets the things that we're talking about in a balance, the uniformity is better. And when you get better uniformity, it depends on the genetics. Some will be similar at the same time, because when you have a field that's growing uniformly, it's funny how you walk out there, look at whack, and that's what you'll get. And that consistent uniformity is what you get with the maximum corn production.
Like always saying, then on for years, uniform emergence key.
That's right.
And having from there on,
right,
uniform the whole time.
Yes.
And then that helps it ear placement pretty much the same because the stalk
are all very similar, because when you look at one to the other, it's a constant battle for the space. So they're battling each other. So you might one gets a little higher and the other one catches up. They're back and forth. But you look at it across the field and it's like you're looking for a tabletop field, because when you get a tabletop field, as long as nothing goes wrong from that point forward, when it gets down to the end, the yields aren't all exactly the same because there's all kinds of little microclimates, but they're pretty close. It's like, all of a sudden that yield monitor, you got to start out there, that yield monitor comes up and man, she stays there or goes higher at different places.
So these products right here can and probably will help not only with your root system, but help with uniform emergence.
Yes, right.
Everybody.
That's the number one thing that anyone who has signed up with the high yielding people and their programs and their consulting, that's the first thing that they learn and the most important thing that they learn. And if all they did was learn that and learn how to do it, they've paid for their investment. Beyond that, I would say forget it, because there's a lot of other stuff that you're going to get that's kind of so-so. But if you don't set up a planter and a system to give you good uniform emergence, you're never going to achieve consistent high yields. It's not going to be done. You can still make good corn. You can still have record spots, but you're not going to get uniformity of the yield that you're after, which is going to make you the most money, the best return on investment, which is what this has been going on for years.
Not that some of these products didn't do a good job. It wasn't across the whole field.
Right.
And that's what my problem is year after year.
Right.
Especially with my soil variations and everything.
Yep.
It's not, I can and possibly have uniform emergence a lot of times, but through the soil changes, it may not be.
Right.
And then on top of that, a lot of the problems have maybe been untimely rains and stuff like that. Unfortunately for me, it impacts different parts of the field more, but then in the end, in the yield, not there.
That's right. That's right.
So,
and I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And this is one of the reasons why, even over time, as much as we could, we encourage people to use manures. Even though you can get a better even distribution in a sense with dry fertilizer, the manure brings in carbon, which is the biggest limiting factor is carbon. And if you can bring in more carbon into that system, bring up the levels a little higher, but bring in other micronutrients and some other things with it at the same time, plus this carbon, that has helped the soils in many cases that were pretty widely variable, reduce some of that variability. But
you're a big advocate of chicken litter or
if you can get it. I mean, we've seen, because the other thing is the litter by itself, just left out there, isn't very consistent. But litter that's actually been incorporated into a program that's like this, that we can put biology on and transform a lot of that nutrition that's locked up in that manure and turn it loose into this season at the right times, that has become a big help. My guys that are consistently at or above 300 bushels in our part of the world, which is still uncommon, those guys have been with me for 25 years. It's just the guys who have manure that are consistently there. Everybody else struggles. They'll still get 280 bushel corn. They'll see 300 on the monitor, but they won't get anything close to 300 bushel averages, where all my guys with manure that have been on this program for a long time can be out there. They'll have fields that won't average under 300 in certain years. They're the only guys, not the guys who are spending money on fertilizer like it's candy and have yields off the scale.
those guys. How much?
Well, some of them aren't even putting in 200 units, because here's the situation. And also now we're not talking, see, we got to be careful talking, because you're talking maybe some sandy loams that are irrigated. So we got to be careful here.
Well, I know there's a goal.
Yeah.
Where you're at, Franklin, Midwest, all that,
Yeah.
Now, a lot of those guys out there, like, you don't want to put any on it.
Yeah. That's right. Because, there's two things that we were going to cover in this, is how much nitrogen do you actually allow coming into your program from your soil? I've done this all over the country, and I can tell you probably on two hands, the number of people, when I talk to hundreds of farmers every year, the number of people who've actually said, oh, I actually allow for, this many units of nitrogen to come into my system based on my soil giving it to me. Most people never give you 1 unit. Each percent of organic matter is designed to release 30 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per percent per year. And of course, it's not doing it this time of year. Soils aren't warm enough, right? It's going to be during the growing season. It's going to be sometime here between, let's say, February 15th to, even August 15th, even September 15th, because you're warm enough. It's going to be during the season. Most people don't allow for any of that. The nitrogen that comes out of that organic matter, if it's coming out too soon, it gets converted to nitrate. A lot of it gets washed away. If it's done properly and allowed for it to be changed over in the plant or sucked into the plant and then changed over, you can influence that. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But most people don't do anything. They don't allow anything for the soil. I go to soils out in Iowa and South Dakota, 6% organic matter. They've tried it many times. 0, 75, 100, 125, 150 units of nitrogen. Sadly, many times a 0 is just as good as everything else, because if it rains right, there's so much nitrogen. I mean, 6% times just 30 on the low end, that's 180 units. On the high end, that's 360. They put lots of nitrogen there. Year in, year out, most of the guys who know what they're doing never put more than 75 units of total nitrogen out on a crop up there. And they're fine. And that would scare anybody down here to death, because you know what the corn would look like midway through the season. Because you don't have 6% organic matter soil. Right, right. The other part of it is if the more you front end load it, the more you've got to put on, because it's going to change. It's going to turn to nitrate. It's going to be moving everywhere. So the more front end loaded you go, the more you've got to put on to try to make it last. If you break it up, it's not hard at all. As late as you could. That's right. And what you'll find out now, because I've been doing this for the last several years, is the more thiazole you put out, and less 28 or 32, the higher the yields will go. And you'll say to me, wait a minute, now that's a 120026 compared to 2800 or 3200. We're going the wrong way. If we go skipping through these slides to get up to the point where we get to VT, tasseled corn, you got to realize that when you start to get reproductive in that plant or close to it, the plant starts building up nitrates. Nitrates do not move below the lower 2 or 3 nodes of corn above the ground. They can't. They're physically stopped. So the only nitrogen that moves from that portion is nitrogen that comes in as ammonium or amine forms of nitrogen, it's amino acids. That is escorted directly to the kernels. Comes in as nitrate, is packed away. You might have heard that you could get money to go out and do late season stalk nitrate tests on your corn. You do that, you start doing numbers. 2,300 to 2,500 is about the maximum you would need to make a high top end corn crop. 2,300 to 2,500 parts per million. All right. Government came out with money years ago, and there's a lot of people out in our part of the world, they compete for that money because they want to check and see how their efficiency is going. So those numbers start coming back. 10,000, 12,000, 15,000, 20,000, 25,000 parts per million. It's a race to the bottom as it's a race to the top. So if nitrate moves into that plant and cannot go anywhere, and that's all coming from this excessive nitrogen and lots of moist soil that's converting, because when the soil gets above 10 to 12 parts per million, that's around 20 to 25 pounds. If you go out here under these pine trees, you dig around, that's what that soil carries. That's bioregulated by the microbes in the soil. When the microbes see that nitrogen above a certain point, they kick on, convert it to nitrate, because that's the only way to wash it away. God comes along, brings us a rainstorm, boom, because that level is toxic to the system above that point. So we're trying out here to maintain these high levels. And so what do we use? Well, we don't want the microbes killing our nitrogen. So what do we use? We use antibiotic killers to kill the microbes that convert it. We're just trying to kill it so that it can't convert the nitrogen. So whenever it sees that excessive level, boom, it's gone. They change it to nitrate and they're waiting to wash it away. What we know now is we've known for years that if we use thiazole, and thiazole is 120026, thio in the world of chemistry means elemental. So thio is elemental sulfur. So you've got ammonium thiosulfate. So you got ammonium sulfate with actual elemental sulfur in it. That's what it is. That will stabilize a 28 or 32% band for somewhere around 20 to 21 days based on Tessenderlo-Curley's research that they did years ago. They were the initial people making that product. Right? So you can actually, as long as you've got a 10% solution, you can stabilize that nitrogen pretty much for about 20 to 21 days on its own. But if you put a lot of nitrogen in there, there's no way you're going to stop it even up to a point. Now, this is what we've been doing, interestingly enough, is if you understand that a lot of this goes back to the carbon to nitrogen ratio. You hear a lot of people talk about it, but nobody wants to really explain it because most people don't understand it. But here's what it means. If you've got a lot of carbon in the soil, and since the microbes eat first at the table of the soil and the plants get the leftovers, if they see a lot of carbon, they want to eat it up because they can take that, turn it into energy, make babies, right? But they got to have nitrogen to finish the deal. They got to make protein. All carbons would be like carbohydrates to us. They need carbon and nitrogen because they need to make protein. So they need nitrogen. So they start sucking up all the nitrogen. So that's why when you have corn following corn, they tell you if you're putting your nitrogen everywhere out here, you've got to raise your nitrogen level by 30% or more to put more nitrogen, because when you lay all this carbon down into that soil, those microbes are going to chew. And when they chew, they're going to tie up your nitrogen. So you have to provide them more. And then when that nitrogen comes out of those dead bodies, wow, this corn crop's fantastic. But you have to oversupply that system. Here's the thought. If you put down a really high, rich band of nitrogen in large parts per million in this band, boatloads of nitrogen. The first thing the microbes see when they see all that nitrogen is like, uh-oh, we're too high. What do? We convert it. We use thiazole to keep that from happening. We save it. What happens if we take humic acid or fulvic acid or some sugar, which is not as good, it needs to be fulvic or humic, and we throw the carbon to it? Now they see the nitrogen band as what? Oh, nitrogen is too high, but it's like, who put all this food in here? Who threw all this carbon in here? So when they see the carbon, they go nailing it. It's like, look at all the nitrogen. All of a sudden, 72 to 96 hours, that nitrogen band is gone. In all these live living microorganisms that are going to now live and die over the next several weeks. And when they break open and their bodies bust, they're making nitrogen available to you as an organic, sustained nitrogen band for weeks, well into and past pollination and grain fill, and where we've got guys that are saying, I've been doing this now for the last 3 years. I've dropped my total nitrogen inputs. I've changed it over to thiazole because the sulfur that's in there makes the nitrogen units more efficient. And they said, by all rights, we shouldn't even had a decent corn crop because there wasn't any rain. Yet the corn yields are fantastic, and the test weights are 63 to 65 pounds. Why? Because the nitrogen that, especially if they're wide dropping it right over the row and they only need a little bit of moisture to kind of get the job done, all that nitrogen is in the right form. It's bypassing this nitrate problem down here, going right up to the kernels, and every time they get rain, they get more. If they get heavy dew, they get more because they're placing it a little bit differently. But this is the whole idea of understanding exactly what the fight is. Nobody's ever bothered to stop and explain to us what the fight is. If we'd understood the fight, we could have said years ago that if I put on 180 to 200 units of the right nitrogen, the plant's going to get more. All right? We're completely away from this by now. But the whole point is, if we want to finish this discussion out, because this is where it goes now that we're thinking this way, you've seen amino acid nitrogen. We have one in here called Enforce. The analysis on that is 800. Most people would take a look at the price of it and say 800, I don't want anything to do with that. You know, because if that costs, what's a gallon of Enforce cost down here roughly? So let's take $12. $12 a gallon. Do you not know that 28% can be purchased for what? $1.50, $1.75? A lot more nitrogen than that. They trip over that number. If you realize that a lot of the herbicides that we put on out here on corn and soybeans and some of the other things, and it's carrying over and doing all kinds of stuff, do you know that a lot of those are amino acid synthesis inhibitors? That's how they work. They call them amino acid synthesis inhibitors, right? Which means what? Amino acid, one of those 4 strange words we said a while ago. Critical to life, right? Synthesis, which means make. So you got amino acid synthesis inhibitors. So what it's telling you is the plants can't make all the amino acids they need to make. Fortunately for us, the crops survive that whole process. Weeds do not. However, the weeds are still suffering from the fact that they can't make their amino acids. Now, I had a real bright individual years ago, 2010, that did my annual meeting for me. He said, boys, he said, here's what's going on. If you think about amino acids as being critical pieces of development, crop development, which they are, he said it's almost like this. If I said the alphabet is made up of 26 letters, and we're going to take out A, E, I, O, and U, I want you to write me a paragraph about your life and also tell me your name without using A, E, I, O, and U. It's like, there's going to be a lot of gibberish going on because people aren't going to understand anything, right? We're not communicating anymore because several pieces that are critical are gone. Now, if I said, okay, let's put these 5 letters back in here, and you go back to that same paragraph, it's a very short period of time, just like that, all of a sudden now we understand exactly what you're trying to tell us. That's what happens when you take amino acids out of plants. They're critical systems that allows them to go ahead and complete protein and enzyme systems that make them run. If there's a limited amount of these amino acids around, they're not running on high gear. They're running in a wrong gear. We come in here and we put on amino acids at a critical time, which is really at or near pollination or post-pollination. And we have some guys in here. See if we can bring one of these up here. Passing by all this good stuff to get to all this common stuff.
So here we are again.
Yes, we are, but we're going on. We have a trial that the guys have started looking at this, and this is not uncommon. There's 3 trials. You see the fields over here. This is the yield maps on the right side. And so you've got the bottom one, the middle one, and the upper one. And what we're looking at is basically just a foliar of shift, enforce, and relief, which enforce is the amino acid product. You're looking at, on the bottom, 276.9 is the average in an untreated area. On the top, you're looking at 298.66. You're looking at a 20 bushel shift. By applying amino acids around VT with a little bit of energy and a little bit of ethylene inhibitor, which takes the stress off of the plant. You're looking at a product that costs you somewhere around 14 bucks an acre. All 3 of them together, and it's delivering 20 bushels. How does an 800 deliver 20 bushels? It's not the 800. It's the fact that the nitrogen is in the amino acids. It's the amino acids that are missing. This is only one crop. This happens on most every crop because all of these things are dealing with leftover garbage in the soil, plus some of the herbicides that we put on this season. And little by little, they're just stealing away. Just like when we think about eating poor quality food, we know the stomach stops growling. We feel a little contented, but we're never quite full. And then all of a sudden, 5 years down the line, we've been eating the wrong food, and we go in and the doctor says, hey, you got this problem here and this problem here. The food is not doing the job for us. You're not getting the nutrition you need. It's the same thing. There's no difference. And it doesn't matter whether it's a cotton or a peanut or a corn plant or a soybean plant. They're starting to show this because nobody's bothered to tell people what's the rest of the story that we're dealing with that we didn't know we were dealing with. And we're talking about the difference between, if you had 276 bushel corn, ain't nothing to sneeze about on that. That's pretty darn good. But the difference between 276 and 298, I beg to differ. Talk about uniformity and some of the other pieces. It's like, how many of these pieces are still missing that when we start filling in the details, it's not subtle anymore? This is only one example. If we back it up, where we were talking about what we've done, even with looking at this stuff, where we've got nitrogen fixation, where the guys are looking at Pivot Bio. Pivot Bio comes out here and says, we got some biology, you put it into the soil system, you pull back 40 units of nitrogen. When you pull back the 40 units of nitrogen and you use the Pivot Bio, you're going to have as good or better corn. Okay? That's a different system. The problem is it's not made to go with starter. It's not made to go with micronutrients. It's not made to go with anything. So if you're shooting for high yields and you're trying to mix it in there, it doesn't work anymore and it voids your warranty. But most people don't look at it as cutting back the nitrogen. They say, well, if I'm going to use this stuff and this stuff makes 40 pounds of extra nitrogen, what am I going to do with it? I'm going to include it in my system to give me what? 40 more units of nitrogen. It doesn't work that way, but that's what they want. The beauty in this is These are all side by sides with complement, the other biology that we've been using for years. This was a study that was done right in the farm and in the field by the farmers there in central Illinois here. This was in I think 2022 or 23. So the top one is where we use the competitor. The one right underneath it is where we use complement biology. That's our biology package. Look at all those different yellow boxes. That's where everyone there's a yellow box, there's a significant jump in the tissue levels of nutrients up. So you've got two studies, the two top boxes, the two bottom boxes. Both of the ones that don't have any yellows in them are the ones that are just the nitrogen manufacturers. Is corn all about nitrogen? No, it's about all these other nutrients. So these are guys in Kentucky.
So right now here, part of this with bio. See how it's dry this past but not bad. Come back here, see the flag. There's a flag. There's a double row. And now it's the complement zone. And what do you see? It's much fuller rows. The rows are more covered. You see less ground. These plants are actually larger, fuller, doing much better on the complement.
So the point being, it doesn't make Pivot Bio bad. Doesn't make it bad. It's just like, why pay more than 2x the price for one nutrient when you can get all these other nutrients for the same price and it's way less? It's half the price or a third of the price, depending on where you buy it from. These poor guys have been out here for years, and they have dealers that have been doing it for 3 years now that finally told them, look, we've never won once. And they wanted them to continue to buy, and they're like, no, we're done. You know, people don't buy stuff that don't work, and they stop buying it. So, but the beauty of this is if you actually compare apples to apples, this is what I find fascinating about all this, is when you start looking at root systems where you go out here in side-by-side comparisons and you look at them, seriously, dig them up and look at them. If you've got the one on the left that has complement biology on this, you know, we get these pictures all the time. It's pretty common with biostimulants. People are like, oh, wow, look at the difference, right? You put that root mass underneath. You got the one on the right, still not a bad-looking corn plant with a decent root mass underneath it, right? But if you're looking at them side by side, I want to ask you, which one has more nutrients in? It's common sense. Here's the interesting, I think, this is what I try to tell people. It's like if you were comparing this. Exactly. Now think about this. What did I have to do to that soil test? Physical soil test, numbers and everything else. What did I have to do to that soil test to make that happen? That is the correct answer. I didn't have to do anything. Would you call that technology? What does atrazine do? Kills weeds. Would you call that technology? Because you can do it year after year after year, and the atrazine kills the weed within reason. So with technology. That's biotechnology. If I can make that happen, here's what I'm getting at. People keep asking about return on investment, right? If you can do that consistently year after year, and common sense tells you, as long as I keep things somewhat moderated and I'm digging around, because the average plant explores maybe 3% of the area underneath it. What happens if I double, triple, or quadruple the root mass? You see where this is going? This is what throws people, because they're not stopping to think about the reality of the situation. Now, if I want to put a little more nutrients in there, that's fine. But you don't go in there and take micronutrients that are down here at levels and macronutrients that are way up here and keep adding more macronutrients. If you do that, these become your limiting factor. There are people that have never used a pound of boron in their entire life, and yet they drive these macronutrients through the roof. And I've seen guys this year that spent more than $200 on P&K per acre on a corn crop already. Nothing else, just $200 on P&K. They've never bought a single pound of boron in their life. That single pound of boron is an in-the-money bet on their soil test, because I looked at the soil test and I said, by the way, have you ever used a pound of boron? He says, no. That guy invested $200 to drive that higher, and the limiting factor on his corn crop is boron. It's a 30 to 50 bushel increase if he raises this. It would have cost him $4 an acre to do that, since he has no information about that because Nutrien, who's selling him, tells him nothing. He's giving up all that extra income, hoping for better ROI with no more boron. He's out. There is no replacement for boron in chemical reactions in your plants. Nothing replaces boron if it runs out. Many other things can substitute for each other. Boron cannot. So here's a man that's hoping for higher yields, investing in things that are completely wrong. He was sick, and rightfully so, because he did it on several thousand acres. That's the kind of industry that sadly we're a part of today. And we can't keep doing that. But something as simple as this, if you put that 2x2, that boron 2x2 with all the other pieces we're talking about, is that root on the left going to find that? You're darn right it is. And it's going to find it in time to have an influence on the bottom line of yield. And this is what's screwing up agronomy. Agronomy is all about a few nutrients. No. Agronomy is about how soils provide, how plants grow. How do you influence this whole system? And knowing that corn plant, because if you count the leaves, of course, a few of the bottom ones have been pulled off, you can see because he was exposing that. But that's a plant that's clearly at least at, well, if you do the left one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's a V6 to V8 plant. That plant's already determined its ear. It's already determined. It's over. So if you understand that good root mass is out there doing the work, it's going to make a bigger, better ear. That's the point. So now it's a matter of taking care of it the rest of the season. The only bad thing that ever goes wrong when you see these side-by-sides, because oftentimes you'll see, when you get the final yields, oftentimes the one on the right will out-yield the one on the left, even though it's so big and pretty. Because what happens is, if you set this plant up and it's perfect, and you're in a dry land situation, and all of a sudden, right at pollination, this one's a full week ahead, and this bone dry and hadn't rained for weeks, and then 1 week later it rains, after this one's already shot the pollen wad, and the one on the right just starts to pollinate, the one on the right beats the living dickens out of the one on the left. Wasn't anything you could have done differently. That's just the way the world give it. When you have water to put on the crop, now it's a different story. You understand that you have control of your situation and you can move this thing forward in a right and true way. You can control that. The guys in dry land, oftentimes they have no hope or choice. One of the things we jumped off, because I didn't get to finish it, and we're going to jump into this real quick because you need to know about it, is the whole idea of biology and what it does to make orthophosphate available. The soil, as it works with biology and releases phosphate, that phosphate is completely identical to the orthophosphate you're going to buy. They're one and the same. They have to be, because otherwise it won't go into the plant. They're all orthophosphate. I ask people all the time, what's a perfect long season starter? Is any one of these three by itself a perfect season-long starter? The answer is no, because there is no perfect season-long starter, because starter isn't designed to last the whole season. Starter starts you off. So if you put biology that's in a cyst or complement in with your 725-5, you have a starter program that sets the year. If you decide to include high polyphosphate, because it's got lots of the poly in there, it's going to break down over the rest of the season. So if you put biology and 725-5 on the seed, and you want to use a little 1034-0 to maybe extend your biology or your phosphate breakdown, fine. But that's not a starter program. That's an entire program. We found this out through potatoes. And it doesn't matter if it's potatoes or sweet potatoes or cotton or peanuts or corn. They take petiole samples, which if you know a leaf, they've got all the leaflets out on the end, and then there's a stretch that attaches to the corn or the potato vine. That stretch is called a petiole, and they pull those, and they've been checking these for decades, watching the phosphorus levels, the tissue levels they call them petioles, tissue petioles. So what happens is, in a normal situation, you see the blue line with the dots and the red line with the dots. So the blue line is the first critical point, and the red line is a really bad critical point. And so they're looking at what the tissues are doing, and underneath it, you can't see it, but those are dates in the season. And we're talking about late June, early to mid-July, early to mid-August, when the potato set starts to fill those tubers. They call that fill. And during the fill period, there's boatloads of energy required. And as a result, the petioles fall because it's using boatloads of energy. So what we figured out in 2022 was some of these guys, they drew in that red line. That's the normal process that most all potatoes follow in that red line. You see it's fallen out way too soon in the season. They started looking where we started putting on orthophosphate in the furrow with the potatoes when we plant them. They come back and they throw a little orthophosphate through the center pivot, especially when you get right before these plants get into the tuber fill, and they throw the biology to it. When they threw the biology and the orthophosphate to it, all of a sudden, these numbers start to pop and they stay above the critical lines. And what guys were starting to see was, hey, you know what happened? The yield of our potatoes went up because, see, you're sustaining energy longer, so the fill is longer and the fill is greater. So they call it specific gravity. They don't call it test weight in potatoes. They call it specific gravity, that calcium you're talking about. You pound in the calcium, you pound up the sugars and the starches, and each potato weighs more. That's 2022. In 2023, they went back and started breaking it apart. So here's the conventional treatment on the left, and you can start to see when they got to the late part of July, early August, they'd already fallen below the blue and the red line. On the right is where they did the program I just discussed with you, and look at that. They had one that got down, two that got down to the blue line. Everything else stayed up. Now, a normal yield for these guys is somewhere between 450 sacks an acre. Those are 100-pound sacks, right? So you're looking at what, 45,000 to 50,000 pounds an acre, right? That year, over 600. That year, potatoes were $15 a bag. They went out and spent an extra $75. They made more than 1,500. And they learned all about the problem that they'd been suffering with all these years, and now they don't have the problem anymore. So the guys that are on this program now have already built into their system an automatic increase. It's given every year now. We also look at the microbes. The biology is extremely important. It's become a really big part of the industry. We have our own laboratory now. We're starting to grow all our own microbes and do the things we're doing. This is as a complement is the biology you could put in the row. You can just buy the biology. If you want a seed treatment version to put on seed, whether it's cotton or peanuts or corn or soybeans, you can buy Originate, which is a seed treatment. The beauty of this is, as you start to look at these root masses and the stuff side by side, you see the difference in the root growth. The thing that's critical about legumes is if you have peanuts or you have alfalfa or if you have soybeans, it's not so much with cotton because it's not really a legume, it's more of just a woody plant. You have to have iron availability to make a nodule. So if you double, triple, quadruple inoculate with rhizobium, and you go out and you're like, well, something must be wrong with that stuff again. I got all this inoculant out here. I'm not seeing any more nodules. And it just makes you mad. It's like, that stuff must have died. The very first year we started doing this and looking at them side by side, we're digging soybean plants out of the ground. They barely got their emergence leaf on them. And there's nodules all over the root. Because what we found out was in the microbes that we're looking at, several of them are converting iron and making it available for the plants when they're on the roots. And where there's iron around the roots and there's a rhizobium, boom, wherever that rhizobium touches that root, immediately if there's iron available, a nodule starts. And so we've got beans out here like this big, already got nodules on them, and some guys never even see nodules till beans are this big or something. With no rhizobium on them at all, just the complement package. On the left down here, this was actually, I think, southern Alabama or southern Mississippi. What you can't see, you see the green line. This side was actually treated with the seed treatment, just put on as a seed treatment right on the soybeans before they went in the ground. And those were actually naked beans. There was no treatment on those whatsoever. Those beans have been in the ground at this point only 3 to 5 days. They're out of the ground and running. The other ones have a full fungicide treatment on it and everything, and they are barely even cracking to start growing. And these are already to the point where, within the next day or so, they're going to have their full emergence leaves on. And people are looking at this like, well, we have to have the treatment to get the replant.
So to clarify, complement and Originate are the same microbes, it's just that Originate is concentrated
Seed treatment version.
put on seed treatment versus complements bulked up, so you put more volume on, you get like a pint per acre.
Right, just distribute in the row.
That's what
But so you're looking at what is total nutrient release, total root mass, depth of taproot, quantity of extra fine roots. This is what we're looking at to try to beef up this whole system. And, you know, if Syngenta had a whole this stuff, it's going to be 25 to 30 bucks an acre. It's just the way it is. Liquid. Mm-hmm.
About 3 to 4 ounces per 100 pounds of seed.
And you can, since it's water-based, if what happens is you can't put too much liquid on these beans. You know, if you're treating them yourself or you're taking a guy who is treating, he's like, I can get somewhere around maybe 8, 9, 10 ounces per unit. Can't get over that. So we tell them, if you're using water, pull the water out and use this, because this is a water-based product. The microbes are dissolved and, you know, they're running around in water. So if you need water, just use the ounces that you're using here as the water, and it'll work fine to dissolve the other fungicides and everything else. Yeah. Just a matter of whatever they do to get the treatment on. So you'd have to get it there. If they're already pre-treated, you'd have to over-treat. If it's something that they haven't treated them yet, you could take it to them and tell them, hey, I want this. You'd want to use it in the treatment. Yeah. And they're live microbes, so they'll live so long on there. And then some of them actually, before they die, they just turn into spores, which are kind of resting stages like seeds. So, you know, sometimes if they're doing it right fresh, it's no big deal. But if it's something where you've got peanuts that have to be treated, you know, a couple months ahead of time, that's not a big deal. Now, if it's something where you're looking at 6 months, that begins to become a big deal. And that's the challenge with some of these treatments. But the beauty of it is, with all this stuff on the seed itself, as they begin to grow, what we're finding is the recent research that the universities are coming out with, they're telling us that the crop as it's growing the previous year, if you influence the biology of that crop on the previous year, that it puts it into the peanut or the soybean or the cottonseed, that's the biology that it's preferring to move forward with. The only way you're going to have an influence typically on that is either put it in the furrow or put it on the seed itself as it germinates, because it wants to pick up that stuff the minute it starts to grow, and it starts using whatever it finds as its standard. But it, yeah. In the row. That's right. That's right. On the seed. And it's when, you know, if you put it on the seed and every seed gets a treatment, you know you've got it. Whereas in the furrow, you just want to make sure you've got good, even distribution within that row and get the microbes mixed up in it. Because when you do that, then it's going to find a whole lot more biology. And the diversity of the biology, the different kinds of strains that it finds, are very important to it. And that's where the system's gone wrong, especially with tillage in the last 60 years, is the tillage has basically just kind of taken the diversity that we used to have that was in the side ditch or the woods or whatever that used to be in those fields. And the diversity has gotten limited, more limited, more limited. So the communication's going on between the plants, because the plants sending out signals, waiting for a return signal from certain microbes. And when it's not getting that, it's not communicating properly. So if we diversify that biology in the furrow from the start, it gets to grow some of these microbes on its roots. It actually physically provides the sugars and amino acids to grow those microbes. Not necessarily. It just depends on your system and what you're doing, especially when you're talking about peanuts. If it's in lots and lots and lots of tillage, it's probably not a bad idea to have both. Soybeans, you could make the case that one or the other might be okay, might be enough. But, you know, depending on whether or not you've got like root knot nematodes and some other things you're fighting, if you had it, you'd be better off to put some on the seed and put some in the furrow. Just part of, because, you know, one of the things is nematodes, when they come out, when they send out their little, they call it proboscis, nose, needle, whatever they call it in your area. When they come near the roots, they swim to the roots and then they push out their needle. They push out their nose. To poke a hole and suck stuff out. That needle's made of chitin. You've heard of chitin. Yeah, and chitinase means chitin melter. That's an enzyme. So whenever lots of those root nematodes come there and they start sticking out their noses, and the microbes that are supposed to be growing around those roots, when they sense all those noses and all that chitin, they produce that enzyme that melts the nose off the nematode. And what's a nematode without its nose? Who cares? You can't say you kill the nematode, because if you kill the nematode, now you got to have an EPA registration label. Yeah, I mean, it's part of the system.
We've had people put this kind of product out, test for it, and they're like, oh, they're still there, but they're not getting the damage. So the nematodes, like he said, they're still there until they die because they can't
Yeah,
eat
the
themselves.
nematodes can always be there.
Oh, yeah.
But as long as they're not
Well, they're-
penetrating the root, then.
Right.
you got-
There are, and there are also good nematodes. You don't want to kill all nematodes. Nematodes are beneficial to a certain extent. There are bad ones that you can't deal with, but there are good ones too. So you don't want to kill them all. And you know, they do serve a purpose. The whole point is the bad ones are moving to your roots. Once your roots start to grow, they give off exudates, they call them. They're giving off signals, and the nematodes sense it, and they swim to the root. So if you protect your root system with microbes around it, that's your best defense. They kill a lot of stuff. And it's, I mean, if it's bad enough that you've got to use that, I'm not saying you can't or you shouldn't. But the reality of it is, over time, if that's all you use and you kill all the other biology, you're going to have a point where you're not going to grow anything anymore. Yeah. And it works. So it also grows those massive, 2,000-pound pumpkins. The plant growth regulator causes those pumpkins to go berserk. And most people, if they knew that, they never go near those pumpkins, because when there's termite growing those pumpkins, I mean, those pumpkins are so toxic, probably kill a whole town. That's bad, but I'm telling you, it grows pumpkins like something else. Well, there's a good example. I mean, this is alfalfa. We had orthophosphate. The guy he set up an alfalfa planter to dribble orthophosphate and biology at the same time in the row on the left. He forgot to turn it on the right, so you can see the difference in the way those things establish. That's all that is. It's just establishment. No different than the soybeans a while ago on the left and the right. We do testing on these microbes. This is the different microbes. The list is ID, and they're numbered on the left, the different microbes. And on the right are all the different things that they can do. So you can look across and you can see, like, one of them might do 5 or 6 or 7 things. Some of them only do 1 or 2 good things, really. We think that this, if it's a microbe down there, it only does one thing. That's not the case. It can do as much as 1,000 different things. It's got a whole library of enzymes it can select out for. So if the plant says, if the greatest percentage of them, if you look over there in the ammonia column, for instance, there are a lot of them that make nitrogen available as ammonia. But there might be only 1 or 2 of them that actually would release iron at the same time. So if all these other ones can release ammonia, don't you think if there's a lot of microbes down there releasing ammonia, if he just releases ammonia along with the rest of them, there's a chance he's not going to get fed. But if that plant's sending out terrible signals like, I need iron, I need iron, I need iron, and this one can make iron, all of a sudden he's like, hey, I'm over here, I can make iron. And all of a sudden it's like, you can make iron, fine. Roots come onto the plant, they go right to that microbe, and they send sugars, and then they grow colonies around there and they make iron. So there's a whole bunch of different things that they can do, and we can test for those all the time. Here's the nitrogen stuff we went through a while ago. Here's the result on that field that we showed you about the side-by-side with the pivot. Complement was 293, pivot was 254. We figured that up yesterday, just even at $4.50 corn. I think the difference was what, $123 or $153. It was a boatload.
I mean, the application was $10. Well, 10 for the product plus the application.
Right.
Well, they permanently the planter, so no application.
So, I mean, it is all still about return on investment. Here, you paid more for the product. You have more things to worry about with the other product. You pay less for our product. You got more bushels. You got a better return on investment. That's the whole point. That's the whole goal. Right.
And less, make more.
Right. You can put stuff in the side bands. Balance is multi-chelated micronutrients. We use amino acids that actually work as chelates in conjunction with regular EDTAs that you buy on the marketplace. You can use, if you use a quart of their 9% zinc compared to a quart of our 9% zinc with the dual chelated in there, you can measure it in the tissue. The dual chelated gives you a lot more zinc because the plant sees the amino acids and says, what? Oh, I'm starving to death for that dude. And it brings in the amino acids. It tears the amino acid apart. When it does, it releases that nutrient. Boom, it goes right to the growing points. Intervene. This is a big one. We talked a while ago about stabilizing that nitrogen. In Intervene, there's fulvic acid, kelp extract, and some micronutrients that make the kelp work better. Kelp contains an enzyme called nitrate reductase, which in the language of the biochemist means take nitrogen that's in a nitrate form, rip off its oxygens, smack on some hydrogens. So it's saying take a nitrogen from nitrate and convert it back into an amine form of nitrogen. That's what kelp has. Kelp lives in the ocean. A lot of the nitrogen in the ocean is already nitrate. So if it's all nitrate, you get these massive kelp forests swinging back and forth. But if it's all nitrate, how does it make a seed? It can't, because nitrate won't make a seed. So it has this enzyme in high concentration. So it can suck in the nitrogen from its surrounding environment. And because it has that high amount of nitrate reductase enzyme, it can bring in the nitrate, turn it into ammonium inside itself, and make a seed. So we say to ourselves, we have corn plants that have got all this nitrogen stuck down in the lower 2 or 3 or 4 nodes, sucking in nitrogen like candy, but it's the wrong form. So we go out here and we either spray on kelp, or we put kelp into furrow, or we put kelp into a nitrogen stabilizer package that goes along with the humic acid, the fulvic acid in this case. We fix the carbon to nitrogen ratio. We tell the microbes, have fun, suck it all up, dudes, turn yourself into billions of bodies. And we also tell the plant, here is some kelp to bring in nitrate reductase for all that nitrate you've already got in it. And it starts converting that, and all of a sudden the plant growth goes through the roof, and reproduction goes through the roof, and test weight goes through the roof, and what shows up is yield.
And what can you do with your nitrogen application if it's in your 32 or your 28?
What can you do with it?
Well, if you're going to put intervene in there at 3 pints
Right.
into the nitrogen,
right.
when he goes to put that out.
Right. So it doesn't matter whether it's 2x2 or a side dress or a Y drop.
Yeah. So what can he expect from that? Can he back his nitrogen down, save some money on his?
And this is where we're headed. We're moving forward with this whole idea of understanding that if we're using nitrogen in the right form and holding it for weeks longer than we were before in an organic form, now we got to have is water. Do you have water? And so it doesn't matter whether it's rainwater or irrigation water. If it's in the right place and it's stabilized right and it's in organic form, the crop is going to use it. This isn't a question no matter how much. It's how long and how much. So what we're getting at is you can reduce the total number of units of nitrogen to get the same or better results, as long as you stabilize it in a probiotic form, not an antibiotic form.
Yeah.
Micronutrients, right.
Balance also
Right.
with some calcium.
Well, actually, my balance was applied on top of the ground, but inside, remember? I wasn't 2x2 exactly, but my point is, so if I was going to use balance
Along with some intervene. Yes. Yeah.
would you do that at planting, or would you do that maybe your last crop dress or something?
The last, well, typically you can live with nitrate on the early side because nitrate's what you want to do to get that plant to grow up. So it's okay to have nitrate on the early side. So it's not as critical. But once you get into mid or late season side dress, or like I said, late season top dress or a wide drop, it's critical that you get that in there, because if not, the longer you have to run that irrigation or the more rainfall you get, as that soil stays warm and moist in these sands with the temperatures you get and everything else, when that soil is warm and moist, it's trying to convert that nitrogen over to nitrate. Right, 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 right.
So I quit through my system a long time ago.
Oh, you did? You mean through the center pivot? Yeah, yeah. Right, because that's a situation where you should have been using straight thiazole. Never used 28 or 32 through the center pivot. Yeah. And if you use thiazole, it'll actually make a difference. But it's a matter of going back to that, and it's a pain.
Well, I mean, I could go back upon something through the pivot, but I hated putting nitrogen through the pivot. It was aggravating to do one, and it's very harsh on your system if you didn't make sure you flush your system.
That's right. Right.
But intervene can help prolong and make sure that I'm not losing all my nitrogen, or at least I got nitrogen a lot longer.
That's correct.
Especially if I did it the last time we tried to go through inside.
That's right. That's right.
Which this past year, I didn't side dress the last time with a liquid form, but
What'd you use? Ammonium sulfate? Perfect. You can go that way. Yeah. I mean, it's not going to be probably as long, but it's better to choose ammonium sulfate than go in there with urea or something else. It's, just urea by itself, especially if it doesn't have any stabilizer on it. You get that wet within 72 hours. If it's not inside the plant, it's going to go to nitrate.
Well, I have used it a lot before, cheaper, but we put a,
Stabilizer on it.
yes, supposedly.
Yeah, but that stabilizer is antibiotic. Whereas if you went to them and let's say it was Helena, because Helena might be down here, say, hey, I want hydrohume sprayed on that urea instead of the EBDTA or whatever, or EBDT, whatever the different types are. I mean, you got your agritanes, you got your instincts, all kinds of other stuff. All that antibiotic stuff, if you just let that go and say, put me on your hydrohume at about 3 quarts per ton of urea, you use that as your stabilizer, you'll still be better off because, see, that's putting humic acid, the carbon, right on the granules. And they'll sell you that because they charge an arm and a leg for hydrogen. It's terrible. I mean, that stuff, it should make all kids be blonde, blue-haired, and PhDs from Yale University, you know? It's crazy what they charge for that stuff. But that's my point. It's like there are things, and that's why we do some of this. And you're looking at about 3 pints per acre. Normally, you're going to use somewhere in the vicinity of a quart per 25 gallons of total nitrogen product. And with fulvic, it's a little cleaner. We like to go up about 3 pints, what we would like to use. And what's it cost roughly? It's 6 to 8. It's nothing more than that. It's no more expensive. It's not any more expensive than the antibiotic stuff, and it lasts weeks longer. I've been doing this now for 3 years. It's one of my fastest growing products up in Indiana for us. And people are like, I have no idea what's in that stuff, but it's just, when you get a dry weather stint and you've got that nitrogen all stabilized, then when water hits, it's like this massive slamming going into this plant. All the nitrogen in the right form. It's not sitting there trying to segregate them out. It just all goes into that plant, and the test weight just goes through the roof. The multi-chelated micronutrients, the old EDTAs are the standard. You start looking at the new ones on the right. You've got an EDTA complex, you know, and what we're doing with the amino acids is just taking little tiny carbon backbones and putting them around it. And then when the plant sees the amino acids, it's like, who just gave me amino acids? It rips those things right away from that metal, and it's even though chelate, it's going to release it anyway. But it just rips them away from it, takes the metals and leaves them there. So the metals go right to the growing points, and so it's a perfect distribution system. We start a whole nother group of things. So you can get them in all the different ones: zinc, manganese, iron, copper, even nickel. We've got some nickel that's also chelated, some other things that's going into these things. You can buy them in Balance. You can buy them in MicroStart. They're already into the SG Infuse. They would also be in the SG Advance with a foliar product. Future improvements are increasing the level of biodegradable chelate. The nice thing about it is this whole technology is moving forward in other industries that are buying it by big bounds. So the costs are coming down. So it's allowing us to be able to go into our products, because we're making them this way already, and increasing the levels of these, let's say, amino acid chelates. So the more we put in there, the price is no different, and you're just getting more and more and more all the time compared to what the old EDTAs are. The EDTA is not really getting that much cheaper, so it's staying pretty constant. But these are getting cheaper, so the prices just keep coming down. So our efficiency just keeps getting higher and higher. So we get up to that situation where we're, you know, around the end of the season, we talked about before. So the shift and the enforced and the relief, that's the product that I showed you a while ago. SG Advance is one that's got micronutrients, it's got sugars, it's got biology, it's got SG Relief, which is the ethylene inhibitor. It's got a lot of other things in it. We actually have people that are spraying a lot of fungicides still at V3 to V5, thinking that they're going to get a big return on investment. Unless you've really got a major problem and you see fungus on that crop. I've only had 2 people in all the years I've been an agronomist that told me that when they sprayed at V5 with a fungicide, they got a response. 2. But we get people all the time, because if you understand that as SG Advance with MKP and phosphites in it as 2 fertilizers and have a fungicide label, now you can go in at V5, and instead of putting on a fungicide, if you're putting anything else on or want to just put something on, you can spray this on that young plant as micronutrients and a little bit of macronutrients with the other stuff, and expect the plant to move forward. It's still at the end of making its ear, so this still has an influence on the ear size, and you don't have to worry about fungus. If you really want a good fungicide down here, if you went to something like Xyway and put it off to the side in a 2x2 early and put the full rate, it will take you through for gray leaf spot, rust, and a few other things. And then if you're going to make another spray around tassel time anyway, forget this V5 stuff. It's just not.
Try to get by. I almost have to take third place to
Golf, right. Right.
Typically, we wait as long as we can.
Before you make that. Right.
Try to make sure we're comfortable about, our pollination period, and then we apply.
Mhm.
Try to get by with one fungicide spray.
Right.
Probably with a stink bug thrown in there if we feel like necessary.
Right, right. So you're not doing anything on the early side with fungicide. And that's the better choice. It really is. But I have a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to pass that up. Then you're better off put it in the fur or put it in the 2x2. I don't.
There are some people that's doing that around here, but I haven't. And we haven't had a problem in years now. We did. Then 10 sort of years ago, because it was bad.
Yep.
I don't remember what year it was.
Yep.
But we have to spray two. I think I had one bill, I think I even had to spray like 3 times.
Wow. Yep. And I think, that's just the way it is. You have to adjust. Just planting it a little later, purposefully. Yeah.
Behind the crop.
Yep.
It's really like.
Yep.
And-
Double cropping.
And doing, Zach's gonna get rid of that, but. That 13 or so years ago, whatever year it was when I did that, man, we had some rough issues come in. And just wiped out.
Yep.
But I have not done anything because I like her.
Yeah. And I just typically tell people that's money that really isn't well invested. It's just not going to.
There's nobody that's really proven that it's
Be-
doing you any good.
The only time you're ever going to have major problems is if you have something like if you had bad wet weather and you were corn following corn and anthracnose jumped on you when you were this tall, that's going to make you a boatload of money because what's the corn plant doing when it's this tall? It's making its ear. And if you've got a disease interfering with that production system at that point, you can't afford to let that disease win. You got to kill it. That's the one time when you need to go out there and take care of that plant. Other than that, typically nothing's going to jump onto that corn plant until it's already done making its ear. So you're not going to get any improvements. Unless that corn plant's almost dying or sick, it's never going to pay you.
And that's always been our goal at around pollination or as late as possible. Most of the time, you're already got your crop there.
Right.
But if we can wait that late, we do have something come on and we apply it then, usually that's gonna protect it good enough to make the crop.
Right.
Finish out.
When you figure that you've got micronutrients, if you've done this with micronutrients and other things to make sure the balance and the nutrition in that plant is good, it fights off the disease. When was the last time? Now we have situations today because of our medical systems and our poor health, poor food health. How many children die of terminal diseases relative to the old people? Young things are balanced better, typically balanced better, and they're not going to get sick. Now, they might get a cold, but they're not going to get terminal illnesses that are going to take them out because their whole system's completely dilapidated. Something old is going to suffer with that more. And it's the same thing here. It's very rare. That's why I said 2 people in how many years? I've been an agronomist for how many years? And they didn't start this fungicide thing until like the last 15 or 20. 2 people in all those years told me they got a response. And one of them was in 2015 when guess what we had? Anthracnose on small plants. So we talked about that shift trial. Now, soybeans. You plant any soybeans?
No, soybeans don't work well with my program and my acres, so I planted some 13, 14 years ago. I have put in one right then. I just don't have enough rotation for the beans.
Okay, all right. If we actually looked at even peanuts relative to soybeans, the hardest thing we've got going on with some of these vine crops, which soybeans are, is that we are doing things in the wrong and proper timing with all the stuff that we're doing. I try to help people understand that if we encourage the early root growth on any of these vine crops, we're going to be doing it better. So when we start talking about putting a starter on if we want to put a starter on your peanuts, we're not going to focus so much on NP and K on those peanuts for starter. We're still going to have lots of carbon and food in there because if we build that root mass early and we put nodules on those young peanuts and we can get the damage that we get from the herbicides down on the young side. I don't know whether peanuts do it. The beans, we see a lot of the stuff that we put on. If you put on Sharpen or Authority of any kind or Zidua Pro, when you get a heavy load of rain on those, it'll take those beans and just shut them down for weeks. I don't know whether the peanuts show the same type of thing. If they do, then this would fit you to a T, because I'm telling you, they finally told us that soybeans are responding to heat units, and peanuts would also respond to heat units. And if those beans or peanuts are sitting there doing nothing for 3 weeks, they're just giving up yield because there's no way to replace that at the end of the season. See? And so we've got a lot of people that they're suffering with that. They also need a lot of sulfur anymore. And so sulfur has been wiped out of the environment by the government mandates. We've been putting it back in with ammonium sulfate. So we use Surge, which is a soybean starter, which could also be used as a peanut starter. We have things in there that actually are helping the system once we actually get it up and growing. So if you've got peanuts up and growing, we would be looking at similar situations with the shift in Enforce and Relief. And then SG Advance, because SG Advance has all that other stuff in it. We used some SG Advance down here on peanuts a couple times. I think the guys were stunned at what they saw because it's balanced. It's got NPK, micronutrients, food sources. It's got some kelp in it. And even though peanuts do have some nitrate reductase in them, not nearly enough to get them enough nitrogen to the end of the season. So we've seen that. And when we did that, yeah. Yes. Right. So, and you could simplify this down. So let's say, for instance, you knew that was going on. You can buy Enforce and Relief if you don't want the shift, which carries a little more of the energy, the sugars and stuff. You could spray Enforce and Relief as many times as you wanted. So let's say you were out there after early thrips and you're going to spray. We'll throw in some Enforce and Relief. And it's going to be fairly inexpensive to do that. And the return on investment is pretty huge because every time you take the stress off of that plant for an extended time, it's more efficient at using its carbohydrates. All the sugars it's making, it's like, oh my gosh, I thought it was stressful. That's right. We actually had a technology here a few years back that we were we were told to keep our mouths shut because we had some... Well, by a guy who said, well, I'm going to give you that information, so you sign an NDA, or if you don't sign an NDA, you just... No, it was a co-op. It was a co-op. The guy worked for the co-op. And he wanted this out here. So we made it for him. It was a calcium product, is all it was. He did. You tried some Liberate calcium years ago?
Oh, Retrieve.
Oh, Retrieve. That's what it was. Yeah, that's what it made it from. But that's a long story. Whole point being, that actually was supposed to help on the thrips, because if you could keep orthene in the furrow longer and it sucked it up, then the thrips stay away. It's just that orthene just washes away. So that was the whole idea. It binds to a cation, and if you bind it in the furrow with a cation and it stays there and it stays as orthene, the thrips will stay away. It was a beautiful idea. So we're like, okay, we'll keep our mouth shut. Well, then they never sold anything. The guy went through a divorce. Another one was one of Kenny's. Well, never mind. But anyway, I'm on tape here. I best keep my mouth shut. But anyway, whole point being, when you start understanding that if you can just take the stress off and give the plant energy, or give it some amino acids so that it can make its energy more efficient and move it forward, it would be different if that application cost you $20 every time. It doesn't. I mean, Relief is maybe what, $2.50 an acre? I have guys that put it on 5 and 6 times on. Every time they make a corn pass, they're putting it on. Every time. Because they're like, the corn really never shuts down. It just keeps growing no matter what happens. Well, that was the shift soybean trial where we did that same thing we saw a while ago. That was 7 bushels. So, that's 7 bushels in a bean crop that's kind of hard to get responses on. People have been tickled to death. So you can imagine, I mean, it could be a significant number of pounds of increases on peanuts.
That was dicamba intervened that the guy called, hey, what can we do? And so we put that program out.
And that's, when dicamba hits anything, put a little bit of amino acids in there, lo and behold, they'll start regrowing again. So the question we should really be asking is, if we know the soil is designed to feed the plant and the plant's designed to feed that soil, how can I help make this exchange work better, faster, more consistently, and more efficiently? That's really what it's about, because that's all agriculture has ever been about, understanding enough of the pieces of the puzzle, and in some cases be ahead of friends and neighbors to be able to understand that if I know this plant a little better and I have things that help the plant grow a little bit better, it's going to do better for me on the same acres that we get. How many acres that you farm are top notch? Everybody has to have that farm acres. That's what we run into up there. The reason we are successful is we keep taking these marginalized acres and getting so much more production out of them that now it doesn't matter what comes up. If somebody says, well, I don't want that piece, it's just a so-so piece of old common dirt. You go over there and pick it up and you start playing this game. Because sometimes you can pick up common dirt for some common prices. Now we're talking some cash. That's ROI. And that's what we've had more impact on that. Perfect soils, wonderful soils that do everything, and sometimes those are hard to figure out because they're just balanced better and they just have that nature. Sometimes you can't take the best of best soils and make them outstanding unless you throw in more carbon, the limiting factor.